Or we are
We're on.
live.
All right,
Hello and welcome to another Collapse Cafe here at the Doomstead Diner. Today we have Steve Ludlam from Economic Undertow who joins us once again, and on the far left is David from the Doomstead Diner, and then we have RE who has joined us in this discussion. And today our topic is about various movements and how we can get over the political quagmires that is affecting various nations, from the EU to America to worse in the Middle East. And this is like a big debate, definitely in the Doomstead Diner, where some people, they will say there should be non-violent means of bringing down governments, and others will advocate for more violent and perhaps some interesting ways of disposing of these potential leaders. In any case, I think the best thing to do is just discuss about the various movements, in particular at the beginning, about violent movements, and what are your thoughts to the various participants today? What are your thoughts about violent movements, David?
Well, I just want to point out to anybody that's maybe listening to this, if you, a lot of diner readers might know me better as Surly One, who is the who writes some articles on the diner. Your question goes directly to what do I think of nonviolent movements? I'm all for them. My friend R.E. and I have famously disagreed on this point in writing in the past. He's in favor of what he likes to call the Orkin Man solution in his own inimitable gonzo style, whereas I tend to think that nonviolence is always a preferable and certainly more morally justifiable solution. It's
Well, before we go too far on that point, one thing that I would like to try to clarify is not so much that I'm in favor of violent movements. It's that I look at the way history has gone and what the outcomes are, what the ways in which human behavior apply in situations like this, in collapse-style situations, and basically, the fact of the matter is, or the way in which these things play out, always has a violent component. So when I try to analyze it and look at it and come up with the Orkin Man and all the rest of that, is to define what the parameters are and what the likely responses of people are going to be as we move down the pipe here. So I don't want to put myself in the camp as necessarily really being in favor of it. I'm just saying that this is how it's going to happen, and this is why it happens this way.
But for every time you have a revolution, every time you a revolutionary movement brings up a Robespierre and we start to decapitate the ruling class, you end up, and this way lies madness. I mean, Robespierre gives you Napoleon, and in Cambodia in our generation we've had Pol Pot, and the writings of Israel Shamir notwithstanding, and Ari knows exactly what I'm talking about. Pol Pot is widely known to be pretty much a monster who gave us the meme of the killing fields and millions of Cambodians dead. So I just, I guess we could go in a lot of different directions with this discussion, but the only other thing I'd like to throw out here right now is, there's, interestingly, in this country, when we had a nonviolent movement like Occupy in the fall of 2011, the powers that be looked at it for about 6 weeks, and then decided to just take the gloves off and put the hammer down, take all the tents down, throw people's belongings into dump trucks and haul them away. That is, when they weren't mauling people, pepper spraying them, or otherwise incarcerating them. I guess everybody by now will have seen the article about a black site in Chicago in Homan Square, where you can be detained, essentially kidnapped and held without any record, any ability for anybody else to find you inside this detention center. And that's getting a lot of attention right now. And this is in the home of the brave and the land of the free. Very different from these U.S.-sponsored color revolutions from everywhere from Egypt to the Ukraine, which seem to be about nothing more or less than destabilizing existing regimes that are not appliant enough for the neocons who are driving our foreign policy. I'm going to shut up for now and listen to you guys talk.
So, what are your views on this, Steve? Do you think that violence can lead to positive outcomes, or do you think they're always going to lead to adverse, unintended consequences? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's a road. Once you go down the road, you don't know where you're going to end up. And, the examples of successful military activity or even, violent unrest, upset the status quo, the examples of successful versions are very small. So there's a lot of attempts.
How about the American Revolution?
Well, the American Revolution was successful in a lot of it's a matter of viewpoint. From the British standpoint, the American Revolution was a failure because it, at a lot of different levels. But it was also a success for them. Even though they lost the territory, they gained a more reliable trading partner. The American Revolution was a British bankers' war. So, if you actually look at the big picture,
they're all bankers' wars. I mean, everything's instigated by economic.
Not everything. A lot of in the Middle East, you basically have intertribal warfare. Some of it's been going on for centuries. So, it's not all bankers' wars. The big major wars that we're familiar with, World War I and World War II, the American Revolution, the Civil War in the United States, it had an ideological component, but it was a way for, like World War I, the United States entered the war because the bankers realized that if Germany won, the French and the British would not pay their war loans back to New York City banks. So banks went to Woodrow Wilson and said, listen, you got to enter the war on the side of the English and the French, otherwise we're not going to get paid. We'll have a finance crisis. So, it was really a failure. It's a tremendous waste. And at the end of the day, you still had Germany, France, England, the other combatants. You had the Soviet Union, communist power that didn't exist before. You had social order upset, millions of deaths and other casualties. And the only people that made out, the bankers didn't get paid in the end anyway. And, the first war led to the second war. So all these different levels, the violence is a failure because of costs. And even if the violence is fairly modest, the costs are still major, particularly as, military activities and internal security, policing and whatnot become more technical, the costs get higher and higher. And,
the failure aspect of it, one can debate in a sense. The outcome. Well, just bear with me for a second. The outcome of World War II was, our current political and social organization, which a lot of people would say was quote unquote a success, at least up until today, or up until recently. We had Pax Americana, we had years of growth and building out this lovely suburban mall-style living that we currently enjoy. So that outcome, which essentially was settled on the economic level at Bretton Woods, and lasted for quite some time. At least, you know, a lot of people say when Nixon shut the gold windows, when that one collapsed. But nevertheless, we got an outcome out of that violent action of World War II that a lot of people would say is good. You know, you had the VJ Day, victory over Japan, etc.
Imagine, Ari, imagine what would have happened if you didn't have World War II. If the world had gone on without having to spend hundreds of billions of dollars and kill off 100 million people, how prosperous would the world have been if you hadn't had World War II? If there had been no Adolf Hitler, if there had been no Stalin, if we were just allowed to do our business, how prosperous would we be?
How prosperous would we be if pigs could fly? You know, the issue here is you get Stalins, you get Hitlers. The outcome of this, look, it's happening right now over in Ukraine, places like that. In Greece, you've got a neo-Nazi party building. Syriza, the communist group of people who's currently in charge, if they cannot satisfy the desires of the Greek people, and right now it looks like they're a bunch of quislings who are starting to play ball with the bankers in Europe. If they can't satisfy them, then the neo-Nazis will drop right in there, and bang, you got the same business all over again. This is the outcome. This is how it goes. I mean, you could wish you could wish it was some other way, but it isn't.
Sometimes it goes and sometimes it doesn't.
Just to interrupt, I think the main difference between things like World War II and perhaps even things like the American Civil War is belligerents in these cases are two separate nations. So the dynamics is always going to be a bit different because it's more clear-cut that we're against these lot of people and we're with these kind of people. The divide is much more clear because it's with different countries. That's the same with the World War II. But as for the Civil War in America and even the American Revolution against Britain, I think one of the differences is pure. You can just boil it down to something even more simple. It's like the relative strengths of the military on both sides. I think in a lot of dictatorships, and this is one of the problems I could see in the violent movements, is the government has a lot more resources when it comes to military infrastructure. They've got the planes, they've got the tanks, you name it, they got it. Whereas the protesting group is very much outmuscled in many cases. I think that wasn't so much the case with the American Revolution. The British Army were outnumbered by the Americans, and they knew it at the time, so their source of power had to be by keeping the elite in line, making them puppets effectively.
I may be mistaken, but I'm not sure that statement is true.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, Great Britain was, at the time of the American Revolution, a very significant power, not over in terms of naval power, but also in terms of having a standing army. I don't know that the British troops were actually outnumbered. They were outmaneuvered. They were only outmaneuvered. I mean, Cornwallis surrendered to Washington only because the French fleet blockaded the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay and kept the British fleet from entering and reinforcing the troops, making Cornwallis's position untenable. In fact, I think he argued that without French intervention, without the French Navy, that the Revolutionary War might have had a different outcome. It's not my area of specialty, but I do want to point that out.
Well, one thing about that period is that the weaponry and what each side had available was relatively equal. They were on more or less an equal playing field. Muskets, cannon, sailing ships, and so forth. I think the issue nowadays is that you've got one side with with jets and drones and nuclear weapons, et cetera, and then you got on the other side, your mujahideen and the so-called terrorist groups that have IEDs, improvised explosive devices, what do you call it? Automatic weapons, AR-15s and RPGs, and that's about the scope of their weaponry. So there's a huge mismatch there in terms of what those people, the types of damage that they are able to inflict versus the kind of damage that that NATO and the big governments currently can inflict on people, and so you end up getting an asymmetric type of warfare, where one group of people, the type of violence that they act out is quantitatively different and qualitatively different from the type of violence that the larger states with the big militaries can accomplish. In the end, lots of people end up dead. I mean, that's the outcome of these type of things. But the way in which they end up dead is somewhat different. In one case they get beheaded, in the other case they're incinerated by bombs. They're still dead.
Okay, so you've got. Let's break it down a little bit. You have two forces. You have the centralized oppressing force. It can be a dictator. It can be a militarized state. It can be like the United States. You have an establishment that has outward trappings of republic and very democratic functions, but is really an oligarchy that's run by a small cabal of people and big businessmen and their servants in Washington, D.C. And many of these are international. So the real issue is how do you deal with this situation when you're a person, an individual, how do you organize yourself? How do you deal with this mismatch of power so that you can actually make changes? I mean, this is the problem that everybody who actually takes a little time to think about this problem. This is the big obstacle. How do we actually affect any change? We got obvious problems in the climate. We want to do something about it so that our grandchildren are going to be able to have a nice life. Now, how do you affect the status quo? How do you change the establishment? You have a guerrilla war against Monsanto and Peabody Coal. Do you blow up their facilities, or is there some other way that you can affect change? And that's really kind of where the discussion with Monsta started. It was like, there was this idea, this fellow Sharp has a plan. It's like if you follow the plan, you can overthrow the most powerful dictators, and you can do it without having a guerrilla war. Where you don't have prison camps, I mean, it's not going to be painless and easy, but if you follow the program, you've got a good chance of being successful. And
so you want to elucidate that program for me?
Well, basically, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Monster.
Yeah, I was just going to answer that question. I think one of the main contentions that Gene Sharp makes about these non-violent movements boils down to what is even the definition of power. How does one get power? Is it the power to tell people what to do? Is it to make people compliant with what you do? I would generally class it as the ability to control people, even if it's to the detriment of their own well-being. That is power, and it can come through force. It can come through social standing. There are various means that it can come about. But one of the central points that Gene makes is that if you can cut off their means of cooperating, like if the institutions that these people in power have are no longer cooperating with their demands, the people effectively become powerless. So, and that is a long game. You have to get enough people to practice civil disobedience. This is what Gandhi and other people they did in the past. They didn't go for violence. They just made sure that enough people didn't cooperate, or failing that, that enough people would take action that they weren't afraid of retribution from the government. If the government punishes people and people still protest, their power will diminish, and that's kind of the end game that they want to see, because the way he sees it is fighting a dictator with violence is just fighting them at their own game. You can't win at their own game. You have to fight by their means.
I think John Lennon pointed out that if the if the people in power flick you in the face and you respond in kind, then you respond violently, then they know how to deal with you. They're trained to deal with you. They've written the laws to frame everything that you do in terms of categories that they can easily prosecute and dispose of. The scenario you talked about a couple minutes ago, Steve, about going to war with Monsanto or Peabody Coal, well, that's now terrorism. All that stuff has been redefined as terrorism. It's on the books. That's why we have a black site in Chicago, because we can detain people legally. Why? Because we sat on our hands and didn't vote and didn't put up a bitch and a hue and a cry whenever our legislators helpfully passed this monstrosity into law. So now we have any sort of organized resistance is now can be classified as domestic terrorism, and my God, here can the gloves come off then. So what do you do? Hold on, hear me out. What you do, what Gene Sharp suggested, which is basically withhold your consent. The most potent weapon we have is the withholding of our consent. Because then, as Monsta says, what do they have? Oh, they can go for a while because they're busy digging up our oil under somebody else's sand. But you know what? Without the consent of the governed, and with enough people in the streets, I mean, during Occupy, it was pretty clear to me the only thing that would possibly make any difference is getting enough people in the streets. Well, Occupy never did.
Well, it's all about numbers, for sure, and in the end, if you can. Once you can muster up the millions of people that are necessary, not 100,000, you've got to cover downtown Manhattan, basically. You got to cover Washington D.C. Capitol building. I mean, it has to be literally an ocean of people before that the numbers are sufficient on the nonviolent level to possibly make any difference. But you brought up the issue here, David, which is that you can be nonviolent, and the government will still react violently to your actions. They come out there and they'll pepper spray you. Even if you're just sitting on the ground peacefully protesting. You can be peaceful, but the reaction you get out of the government is not peaceful. So what do you do in that situation? You just, you take it. You just let yourself get beat up and thrown into jail and so forth and so on.
As a matter of fact, you do. Because there is.
Well, you may do that, but you don't get no results
behind that action. That's what worked for Gandhi. Is the British, beat the hell out of these people who were just nonviolently protesting and put hundreds and hundreds of them in jail. It shocked the world. Now the world is probably a whole lot less shockable these days than it used to be. But I mean, there is moral force in that sort of passive resistance.
Well, there's also there's a practical issue too. I mean, one of the I don't know whether Occupy was successful or not. I think at some level they were successful. I think at other levels they provided an outline. It was like a first step, a baby step. And, they didn't really have a strategy, and it wasn't clear what it is they really wanted to do. Not what their aims were or what their policy was, but they didn't have a tactical plan. And this is something that I think is very important. If you're going to engage in something like this, you really have to map out a plan and say, we're going to do this as a first step, and then second step, and third step. They didn't really have that. And for instance, the big problem with the United States is everything is done on a margin. So what they want to do is, like Ari says, they get somebody who's nonviolent, they take them in the alley and beat them black and blue. Okay? Or they arrest you. They'll arrest 100 people or 200 people. But, they could have organized it such as, like, all right, the first week we're going to go down here and we're going to block down the streets in Lower Manhattan and they're going to arrest 10,000 people. Okay? The next week there's going to be another 10,000 people in Lower Manhattan and they're going to have to arrest them. And then on the third week there's going to be another 10,000 people that they're going to have to. By the time they get to the fourth week, the whole system is clogged up with people. And then the system starts to break down just because of the need to process and give everybody book everybody, get them lawyers. They can all say, I want a jury trial. I'm not going to plead guilty. You get somebody in there and say, listen, if you don't charge me with an offense, because usually when you're detained for protesting, they dismiss the charges. So you tell the magistrate, if you dismiss the charges, then I'm going to sue the state for false arrest. So you overwhelm them with numbers. We're not talking about filling the entire island. If you have 5,000 people in Washington, D.C. get arrested for 6 weeks, the whole system in Washington, D.C., the whole jurisprudence system breaks down. They don't have enough jail space for that many people. They can't put 20,000 people in a camp on the mall. They just don't have the facilities. They're not designed. They're designed to intimidate people so that the majority will go along with whatever happens to, they'll react to what happens to 2 or 3 people or 10 people. They'll single them out and they'll make examples out of them and use that to intimidate everybody else. And it's like, you get past that and you get that sort of strategy, that kind of tactic. This is what we're going to do. The weak point with the establishment in New York and Washington is the jurisprudence system. So let's attack that and break it down. You don't have to have a riot or anything. You just have to go out there and get arrested. I mean, I guarantee you from personal experience, they don't have enough cops to book more than 20 people at a time. They just can't handle it. So, that's the weak
I think
point.
one of the...
Yeah, go ahead, Mansa.
Yeah, what I was going to say is that certainly, like at the end point, if you can get people to protest in that sufficient numbers, it can definitely lead to results. The big issue I see, though, is how do you instill that confidence? Because at the moment, I think people, they're atomized. The governments are good at atomizing people, keeping them isolated, and they'll just think this is futile. This is not worthwhile. I'll be pepper sprayed. I'm going to, they'll give up at the first sign of resistance. And I think this is one of the things that he mentioned is you have to build confidence, little acts, little victories, no matter how small, you just have to do. Like just if you, there's some sort of local problem, just go out on the streets, protest or go to work a bit more slowly in sufficient numbers to cause problems. Any small thing just to instill confidence in people to protest. And I think one of the other things that was mentioned is just building some sort of community or otherwise other institutions. I mean, if you look further in the past with stuff like Rome and things, you can see like the rise of Christianity. I think that was perhaps, I'm not well versed in this, so I could be wrong, but a lot of it was just probably average Joe to some extent, just protesting against the current regime, and they had the institution of the church to.
It was the wives of the Romans, particularly the elites. The elites' wives all became Christians, and then they kind of like led their husbands into it. So, and then the Germans, the barbarians, they all became Christianized once they realized that they couldn't be enslaved. That you're not going to enslave somebody who's a brother in Christ. So all the Germanic people became Christianized almost overnight. So it was an outside in, kind of, subversive kind of approach, and it was very effective. So,
but I think the point is that you need to get people together to sympathize and empathize with your fellow man. I think at the moment, if somebody's lost their job or some injustice happens, it's more like, I'm okay as long as it doesn't happen to me. I think this is
right.
the big problem, you know.
Right.
Well, it's the nothing left to lose aspect of life, if you will. People only start to come together when each of them has nothing. Then you can't take anything from the other person who has nothing, and they can't take anything from you. So you're all on a level playing field. The problem you have here in America is that you have 20% of the population that has something, that still has enough money to drive the car around, live in the McMansion, and text all day on the iPhone, and so forth. And the other 80% of the population that is, well, I would say no, not 80%, 60% of the population currently that's falling off the cliff. They're not all the way down to the bottom. They haven't hit bottom yet, but they're on their way down. And then there's the 10% or so of the population that's been off the cliff for quite some time. And has already hit bottom, and they have nothing left to lose. And they are the people that are rioting in Ferguson and places like that. That's why they do that. The problem in America, if you will, I think, is that there's still enough wealth being distributed around. The people are still getting the SNAP cards, and for the most part, the social welfare network is holding together somewhat. But it is breaking down, obviously, and because as the numbers problem that Steve mentioned with the jurisprudence system, the numbers problem is very similar with the social welfare system. It can support 10% of the population that is off the cliff and hurting, but once that population of people is 25 or 30 or 40%, for the other 50% of people to support them it becomes more difficult. So that's where you get your war between the haves and the have-nots. And the people don't want to be paying taxes for those no good for nothing welfare recipients, of course.
Well, I think that's an artificial problem, though, Artie. You get a media says, well, those good-for-nothing people out there, they're just stealing from your pocketbook. You got to hate those people. You got to take them whenever you get a chance.
Well, there's the other part of that, which is, people like to, it's the old divide and conquer strategy. We do a very good job of setting one group of people off against another group of people to avert their gaze from the collective gaze from the guilty. We're talking about, I don't know how many billions of dollars the SNAP card program costs. Compare that to what we give away in terms of tax subsidies to banks. And it's a fraction of that. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but it's a small fraction. So it's all about priorities and lobbyists and the fact that most people on the left and the right are utterly disaffected because they realize the system is wired and not for them. You know that story about how if you sit down to a poker game and you don't know who the patsy is, it's you? We're the patsy. Question is, what do we do about it?
It's a very good question, and there's not a lot of good answers to it. Basically, my sense is that you don't do anything about it. You just wait for the system to collapse under its own weight, which it is well underway and well into the process of occurring. It's not really until the network that's held together by money comes apart that you'll be able to affect change. Yes, Steve, go ahead.
Why don't we just say that's option number one? We just let the system collapse, and then we're come up with something on the ruins of the existing system. That's option number one. We'll call that option number one.
Yeah, the problem with option number one is that once you get collapse, it becomes very difficult to figure out how you're going to get enough organization together to be able to fix things. It's nicer if you could come up with something before collapse, or at least have a plan of action of how you're going to reformat society and reformat our world in the aftermath of collapse. And I think that's sorely lacking amongst all the pundits of collapse. Is, you know, people, they tend to talk about things in general, you know, and people say, oh yeah, localization is going to be the solution, which, you know, yeah, okay, but what does localization mean, and how do you effectively become local from what's currently a top-down type of organization, you know, and how do you organize those things?
You sound skeptical.
Yeah, well, I am skeptical. I'm skeptical. It's something that I work towards. I mean, we have our Sun Foundation, which is an idea of trying to develop community in advance of the oncoming collapse. But to be honest, that is very slow in terms of its growth and getting it moving. So I do remain skeptical that we can effectively come up with ideas for how to manage the aftermath of collapse. You've got to wait for it. You really can't do a whole lot. You know, Shirley comes at me or gets on top of me because I refuse to vote. And it's like, okay, well, if you're not voting, then, you know, you're not exercising your franchise, and you don't have any right to complain about the assholes that get voted in here. But I come at it from the opposite point of view. I say, you know, I have perfect right to complain because I didn't vote for those fucking assholes. And every single one from both sides are assholes, always. You know, since I was a kid. So there's no reason
let me ask you another question. Do you think it's possible with any conceivable set of characters to have a functioning establishment that would do some of the things that you think should be done? Is it possible? Is it something that's structurally impossible and there's really no other choice but collapse? And kind of a corollary to that, is it possible that there's not a collapse, that things will carry on as they are for another 25 years?
Well, historically speaking, or looking at the way things have gone, no, there's not a cast of characters that will make things any better. And it's, you know, old boss, same as the new boss. And the construct here that makes it impossible for there to be justice, if you will, is the construct of money. And that's my feeling. Money is the root of all evil. And that as long as you have money, you're going to have greed, and you're going to have people who are power seekers, who attempt to control and monopolize that aspect of society that utilizes trade and so forth to control things. So no, I don't think there's anybody or any people out there that really could make any difference until the system itself collapses, and then you get to see, you know, who the good guys are and who the bad guys are.
But why would that happen?
I think one of the concerns that I have is the fact that, yeah, in the natural order, what you describe is probably going to happen, but then you're just leaving things essentially to fate. And the problem is, what I can see anyway, is as things get more desperate, people become more impoverished, then they will go for these chatelains who will advocate for extreme things. I mean, in the past you saw Nazi Germany, and more recently you're seeing more extreme views developing in Greece and Southern Europe because they find that the mainstream is not catering to their needs. And taking to its logical extreme, you'll get people who are violent, who will advocate violence. And I can see a lot of blowback in that type of scenario because people who are good at violence are not so great at building new governments. And the destruction they leave behind will tend to create a vacuum of power. And these are the blowbacks that are likely to occur, I think. It's not definite, but I say it's quite probable. So that's a problem if you let things just go the natural way. So the question is, I know it may not seem likely, but do you think there are any methods of getting people to work as a community, to understand each other's hardship, any way that you can achieve it in a place like America? I'll just point this question to David. Do you think there's any way that we could increase the number of people who are concerned about what's going on?
I tend to share RE's nihilism on this score, because I think that we are highly distracted people. We are concerned only with ourselves. I think things will have to get much worse for a lot more people before people are shaken from their doldrums or become aware. I think there are certainly highly energized and highly motivated people on the wings of both sides of the political spectrum, but that's pretty much a minority. Most people are content to order a $5 cappuccino on their iPhones and otherwise post cat memes on Facebook and say and are disaffected from politics because they are, even though we're distracted, we're smart enough to know there's nothing I can do about this. In a very real way. I mean, if I vote for a national election, it's really kind of pointless. Parenthetically, I would add where you can make a big difference is voting in your local elections, because that does have. And if you show up for a council meeting, it makes a difference. I mean, I've lived it, I've seen it, I've done it. It does make a difference. It's just when you're voting for your representative, who is one of 435 in the Congress, and your vote is just one of tens of thousands, it makes that much less of a difference.
Yeah, how about if you vote for Jeb Bush or Hillary Clinton for president?
Well, let's just call it dynasty. It's that's why people that want to see an alternative are going to have to mobilize now, which is why you saw the clown car spectacle at CPAC this past week, and I read where Rand Paul won the straw poll at CPAC, so we got that going for us, buddy. Crazy Uncle Liberty and his toupeed son, Senator Akwabuda. But I digress. Anyhow, where were we? I just went down a rat hole.
Yeah.
So sure. I think it's just the main question that I was asking is how do we prevent disorganized rebellion from creating blowback? That was what I was
I don't think
essentially saying.
You got the Brandon Smiths of the world who are advocating for some sort of armed insurrection. As to the point I made about John Lennon earlier, the government knows how to deal with that. We've seen it at Waco and Ruby Ridge. I mean, we're very good at extending what Pepe Escobar calls the empire of chaos and bringing that home. We've tested our MRAPs in Iraq, and we bring them home on the streets of Pittsburgh and other places for crowd control. We bring assault techniques. We've outfitted all of our police with SWAT outfits and armaments. We're sending out military vehicles. We've spent so much money on military vehicles, we can't give the stuff away. So I mean,
they actually are giving it away.
Military vehicle
they give it to the police forces for free.
Yeah, right. But I mean, the fact is that we're very good at bringing that kind of oppression home. So if you go ahead and stand up and resist, and you say, follow me, and you think you're going to reenact Lexington and Concord, you're going to find yourself You're going to find yourself rendition to Poland. Exactly. No way. No way. This way lies insanity, and you can include me out of any discussion of anything like that, because it's a non-starter. What you have to do is, and I'm not sure what form this takes, and I'm not the person to organize it, but I think as Stephen Monstead made the point, I mean, Gene Sharp has really shown a way, and what form that takes in Occupy 2.0 or some other movement, people will have to be motivated, and then they have to be educated. One of the first things we tried to do in the local version of Occupy was to educate people. And that means sitting in, teaching in, having classes, and trying to get the word out. It's a very difficult, time-consuming, and heartbreaking thing to do because because a whole lot of people really can't be bothered.
Well, as you are well aware as well, though, even in that relatively good movement, the government also knows how to deal with that too. They start putting in place agitators and so forth that come in to disrupt the movement. So you know, even by trying to be nonviolent, trying to make the correction that way, you're still being outmaneuvered by a powerful government and CIA powerful state apparatus that can undermine just about any type of planning. You know, Steve talks about, well, you need to plan this. You know, 10,000 this week, 10,000 next week, so forth and so on. But even trying to, if you start to plan that with people, there's going to be infiltrators that will find out about the plan and will figure out some way to disrupt it from.
There are always infiltrators. There are always infiltrators. We had them in Occupy Norfolk. We had them every time an Occupy camp raised its head. There were infiltrators. There were people taking government checks, sowing disinformation and discord, urging people to violence. They're generally, you can identify the infiltrators because those are the people advocating violence. Those and a couple of you know, pink-haired anarchists. But you know, that's another story for another time. It's yeah, I was always the person that who would tell anybody who would listen to me, somebody who advocates violence, you may assume they're cashing a government check. So, but the fact is, there will always be infiltrators. There will always be means, covert and overt, the government will deploy in order to blunt the force of a movement. That doesn't mean that we have to be helpless. It just means we have to find another way to do it. They're going to come.
Well, you know, we had a successful nonviolent mass movement in the United States. It was a long time ago. It was kind of before my time. We've had a number of them actually. You know, the original labor movement, suffragette, anti-slavery, and then the last would be the civil rights movement. Voting and occupational equality, and you know, standing within the official community of African Americans, and it basically ended apartheid in the United States. There was you know, violence around the edges of it. You know, we had in the '60s, of course, you had the Vietnam War, and the civil rights movement grew out of American wars. In Korea, we sent a lot of black soldiers to Korea, and they came back here and they found that they had to use a colored-only water fountain. And they realized, they said, listen, you know, I saved a white soldier's life in the hills outside of Seoul, and I'll be damned if I'm going to drink from a colored-only water fountain. You're going to have to treat me like a man. So that was the impulse, and the thrust of it, there was a moral thrust. There's an ethical and fairness trust. I mean, these people had served their country. Their people were part of America. They built large parts of the country. They need to be treated like human beings. There's an ethical and fairness thrust. The leadership was very patient. And the people involved realized that not just black people, white people too realized they had something to gain from it. So it was a sustained movement over a long period of time. Thousands of people suffered. They got beaten, and police dogs set on, they were shot with fire hoses and tear gas. They were beaten in alleys, and you know, detectives would take them someplace and throw them down a well. And it was any kind of oppression you can think of. And in the end, the civil rights movement was successful. There's a change in law, but there was a change in attitude too. It hasn't 100%, but from where the country was, say, before World War II in the 20s and 30s to what it became in the 50s and 60s is like night and day. So we've done this in America. We've kind of forgotten how. We don't have the leadership today. We have professional agitators in the place people like Martin Luther King. But still, it's there. It can be done, and it has been done, and there's no reason why it can't be done today. I think the big difference is that you can look and say, well, this black person over here is treated unfairly. He can't vote. He can't send his kids to the school right on the corner because it's for whites only. Okay, that's easy to figure out. A lot of the stuff that we talk about is more abstract. Monetary systems, banks, and the oppression of bankers and big businessmen. It's kind of like military-industrial complex. It's hard to get a handle on it, and it's also very hard to really, discuss how to deal with it. It's made out of Teflon. It's gigantic. We're little ants. You got the system is made up of these mind-bogglingly huge organizations that are not accountable to anybody. Maybe to Hercules or some monster, Thulu or something, but they're not. You can't send them a letter; they just won't respond. So it's like, how do you deal with it? And that's really the challenge. But I think that and the abstract nature of the problem. I think if you can get a handle on it, then I think it's possible to have son of civil rights movement. Because that's basically what we're talking about. We want to have the exercise of our rights. That doesn't mean we want to all be rich, but we want to be treated fair. We don't want to be watched by Big Brother all the time. We want to have, some kind of equitable treatment. Basically, we want to be treated like human beings instead of like cyber. And I think that.
Well, one idea I could throw out there, I'm trying to be on the positive side for a change, is to have an anti-corporate movement. You could get about just about everybody to be anti-corporation, and then develop a set of laws that limits. We talk about how big they are. You got Monsanto, you got General Dynamics, you got these freaking enormous corporations that are basically untouchable. Exxon, Mobil, Royal Dutch Shell. So put a limit on the size of the corporation, on the size, number of employees possible, its total scope. Can it be multinational? No. Make corporations small enough where they have to be actually inside states, so that it's more local in size and more manageable. I think the biggest problem that we have as a society is this growth in systems that has made things so big. It's whether it's our democracy or capitalism or communism or socialism or whatever the system is or ism is, all of them are just too damn big, and so they become unmanageable because of size, and size matters.
Don't forget the Move to Amend movement as well. I mean, there is a movement afoot to get enough states to pass a constitutional amendment limiting, ending the horror, the Supreme Court inflicted horror of
Citizens United.
Yeah, Citizens United and corporate personhood, both of which were decided not by legislatures but by courts. So that's a movement that is continuing to gain some traction.
Yeah.
Moderator time.
So I think in the end, I think what it boils down to, I think for me personally, the way people are influenced is, like Steve said, they're not influenced by facts or abstract notions. So all this stuff about monetary theory or even resource collapse is something that they can't relate to. I think the thing that people respond more to is narratives. So if you talk about a narrative of anti-government or anti-corporation, people are more likely to respond to that. And failing that, the most likely thing to get people moving is circumstance. So if circumstances are unattainable, then people will act. They must act. So I think what it is, and what I hope, is people aren't forced into acting, because then it can lead to outcomes that aren't so good. On the other hand, if they could realize earlier, it would probably result in better outcomes if people got together. It's just, can you build a narrative that everyone can stand behind? Because the civil rights movement had its actions. People, they wanted equality. They couldn't stand the institutionalized racism, and there was a good narrative that was going around. We don't really have that. And I think the other thing is there's no real figurehead. It kind of seems leaderless, the Wall Street movement, and in some ways it's good, but I think in another way it's held them back a little bit. I think the final thing that should sort of be addressed is the fact that I feel going forward that we're not going to be a society that gets richer. I think this is the sort of the managing of expectations. You can't expect a better future. You can just hope for a more equitable future where people are treated more fairly. I think this is going to be something that needs to be addressed, because if you feel there's going to be a better tomorrow, the platform that a new leader will come is going to be equally as precocious, because just look at places like Egypt. They brought in an alternative government. The economy has gone nowhere, and they're on the streets again. This is the problems I could potentially see.
Yeah, the problem is you can't sell politically the idea to people that things are going to be worse in the future than they are today. That as a society, we're becoming poorer, their children will be poorer, and so forth. People just don't want to believe that the future is going to be worse than the present, because the present sucks. So this, it's very tough to get any type of political leadership, anybody that will stand up and say what is the truth, that our society and what it's based on is untenable. It can't be sustained, and it won't be sustained. But you can't tell people that, and they won't. And if you do tell them that, they won't believe it. They'll actively deny it, and the denialism is rampant everywhere. We see it on the diner all the time, and you certainly see it out there in real life all the time. Whether it's the climate, the economy, the types of wars that we pursue overseas. I mean, people actually believe that the U.S. military is involved in protecting democracy. I mean, it's obvious now that they're not doing that. But that is, if you walked up to any Joe Sixpack on the street and ask him what the military is doing over in Afghanistan and so forth, they'll tell you we're protecting democracy.
They're defending the opium business, CIA's opium business.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, just today I got a letter from the local MP, and they were saying he supports the war in Afghanistan because it helps democracy in Britain. I mean, it's a very common line dished out, so I can understand that sentiment. The question I direct to Steve is, do you think that you can deliver a narrative that people can believe in? I mean, like Ari was saying, being poorer is not a very good soundbite.
Well, I think you can.
Can you see a way?
I mean, I don't. I mean, I think it's you know, our needs are very simple, and you know, we can get to you know, enjoying ourselves. I mean, the goal of living your life is to enjoy yourself, and you can do that without having all this junk. In fact, the problem is that most people have too much junk. They spend all their time messing with it. They have to categorize it and store it and paint it and fix it, and they have anxiety attacks about it. So they're overburdened with stuff, overburdened with cost. So if you have a more involved, a simpler way, you know, lifestyle, I don't like that word, but you know, if you're engaged in it that way, you can have just as much or more fun. You don't have this incredible waste and all the costs that go along with it. And we've kind of gotten away from that because television tells us that we have to have all this stuff, and we have to, you know, go on vacations and have a luxury job and live in the suburbs in a McMansion and all this other stuff. You're not a human unless you're living like the guy on television. And that's a false narrative right there, but everybody buys into it. And we don't really have, you know, the alternatives are out there, but we don't really see them as such. We look at all that stuff as, you know, like in other countries. I've spent time in South America. You know, people live more simply there, but that doesn't mean that they're not enjoying themselves. In fact, they probably have a better time than Americans. They don't have that anxiety, that occupation and possession anxiety. So the short answer is yes, it's possible to create a narrative. It's possible to make the narrative quote-unquote revolutionary. Then it becomes a marketing thing. So what R.E. said is exactly true. People want to hear good news. They want to hear how things are going to get better. Then after that, there's an assumption. Getting better means getting more. Is having a bigger car, is having a bigger boat, having a vacation home, is you know, having more income and all this, where you don't have to work. And all of these things are just stuff that comes from marketing, big corporations that are in business selling all this stuff. So that's you know, you got to have a dueling narrative. Right now, it's just a one-sided thing. And then you hear, well, if we don't have this new narrative, if we don't do something, we're going to have a crash. And that's you know, I mean, realistically, we're probably going to have a crash. I mean, that's just the way our economy works. It changes by expanding, and then it dies, and it has to start over again. It's a bad way to do business, though. And I think it, you know, my personal experience is that if you're patient with people, and you kind of say, look, you know, this is what we need, you know, as animals, as human beings. It's a human animal needs certain things: food, clothing, shelter, and delight. And you know, you don't need all this other crap. You know, if you can get to the basics, then you know, you can have a nice life. And you know, once you start examining that a little bit, it doesn't sound that bad. It's certainly not, you know, well, one way, you know, the squanderous, you know, lifestyle of rich and famous in Las Vegas, and others living in a tent or a cardboard box underneath the freeway. So there's a room in the middle. So, I mean, I think, yes, I'm restating the same thing over and over again. Yes, it's possible to have another narrative. And that's all I'm going to say about this subject right now.
And what are your thoughts, David? Do you see it possible that you can deliver a narrative that's palatable to the public?
I don't know. I will tell you that we are so propagandized from kindergarten on about the narrative, which is the growth is good, you know, and I tend to share R.E.'s pessimism about the fact that, you know, look what happened to Carter when he lowered the speed limits to 55 and said, you know, you're going to have to tighten your belt a little bit and quit using as much energy. You know, that all was swept away, and the guy that won the election took the solar panels off the White House and announced to everybody that it's morning in America, by God. Now, there was a narrative that sold. And everybody just said, happy days are here again. Let's manufacture and buy and drive SUVs. We have nothing to worry about. Because you know what? Our military will go wherever they need to and get our oil, which happens to be under their sands. You know? So what? Me worry? You got it. That's the narrative that sells. So whether the people in this country will ever tolerate something without a massive dislocation or some radical event. I'm having trouble seeing it. I would love to share Steve's optimism that, yeah, there is a way, and I hope there is a way. But I think people are going to have to, I mean, the one thing, I mean, people in the environmental movement, what's left of it, realize that, you know, we cannot go on like this forever, and people are trying to think about a better way. Perhaps if more people grow in that awareness and realize that we have to live like we're living like grasshoppers. You know, we cannot afford to do this forever. So it could be that there is a byproduct of that awareness that actually realizes that underlines our interdependence and it generates a sense of community. But I see that being many decades out. Not sure I'm going to be here to see it, but you know, I'd like to hope.
Hope is springs eternal, right?
Yeah, of course. I do, in some extent, I'm worried that it will have to be circumstances that changes people's behavior. But I think if there's any way it can change, it's just even maybe the language. Because I mean, if you look at the news today, when was it that the word citizen changed into consumer? You know, in the past, you called yourself a citizen of America or a citizen of Britain. But now you're a consumer. You know, it's all in the language. So we've been trained at an early age that our role is just to consume, to get more. And I think there's just such this emphasis that people equate happiness with having more stuff. And I just think if you can have something where you can just fulfill the basic needs. So you fulfill, you know, you have a shelter, you have a house, you're got few food on the table, you don't have to worry about water and clothes, and that's it. The rest you can get your happiness through social means, you know, your community. I think that's the important thing, and this is one thing that Jean mentioned, is building an alternative institutions to the government. So you have a place where people congregate, they meet up, they discuss their problems, they can, you know, solve local issues, and they're more sustainable, they're more resilient. So, you know, people, they say, okay, localization, what is that? And I just feel maybe it's just trying to get all your needs within your community. The less income you need from outside, the more sustainable you are. So I just feel if there's a way, it's to be more resilient, to be more empowered. And funnily enough, if you could do those things, you could probably put a dent in the power of the government, because I think a lot of their power comes from the fact that we're dependent on the government. We're dependent on an income to support our lifestyle. And where's that income coming from? It's coming from the money in the banks, and the banks loan that money out. What's that saying? That I care not who runs the government as long as I run the monetary system. I can't remember who said that, but it's
Meyer, I'm sure Rothschild.
Yeah. Exactly.
You know, that's the case. We're dependent on systems, and you know, the systems that we depend on are many and varied. The monetary system, of course, is probably the most significant one, the one that ties us and binds us all together, and essentially has become global. So, you know, these are the things that we have to deal with, and I don't know, Mansa. I think it's probably time to call this one a wrap. You want to tie it up for us?
Yep. So I just think in the end, like I was saying just previously, it's just about becoming. You can't be independent individually, but your community becomes empowered. I think it's empowering people and instilling confidence that they can have an influence on their destiny. Because I know people, they say, oh, you can work towards your goals, but I think when it comes to big problems, they're just thinking, like Sterling says, if I vote, what difference does it make? I think it's just empowering people and making them feel like they can have a difference. And how that comes about is anyone's guess, but that is a fundamental problem. And I think on that note, that ends this Collapse Cafe. I hope everyone enjoyed their time spent here, and I hope all the viewers who watch also enjoyed the discussion we just had. See ya.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Monster. Bye.
Take it easy.